Okay, good evening and welcome to this side event on governance of solar radiation management under Vienna Convention. I'm really thankful to the panelists here and speakers who have joined us on this important discussion that we will have today. We are also going to release our report, which is a legal review of why we think that Vienna Convention is an appropriate platform for the governance of stratospheric aerosol injection. Specifically, stratospheric aerosol injection because we believe that the technology which has impact on ozone layer falls within the purview of Vienna Convention. Now, you can start. Before I start the presentation and the discussion on the topic, I just want to give you a brief background about the organization, iForest. The full form of iForest is International Forum for Environment, Sustainability and Technology. We are an independent, non-profit environmental research and innovation organization based in New Delhi. And our entire focus is on promoting and scaling up solutions on numerous environmental and development challenges. That's who we are. We were set up in 2019. We are a relatively young organization. And we call ourselves as a regional organization because we very strongly believe in bottom-up action. So we are a regional organization who work at the national level, but also at international level. But we remain focused on regional priorities. And we work in different parts of India, different regions of India. And all our programs are geared towards building a green economy. These are we work on at a very integrated level of environment sustainability, social justice, and economic development. So absolutely integrated programs for building green economy in India, in Global South, and promoting it at the international level. That's what our programs are. Next. We have 6 focused areas, and one of the focus area, which is strengthening environmental governance, is under which we are organizing this program. But we work on just transition. One of the focus area of iForest work is just transition, just energy transition. We work on green energy. We have a very strong program on urban transition, how cities will transition both in terms of resilience and low carbon in the future. We have a natural resource management program where we work on forest fire, an issue which is becoming problematic every year, as well as on climate resilient agriculture. We have a program on local waste and pollution issues. And as I said, we have a program on strengthening environmental governance within country as well as internationally. And today's event is looking at strengthening environmental governance of SRM, solar radiation management, at Vienna Convention. Now this is the agenda. We are late by 15 minutes, but we will catch up. I'm very happy to have David with us, who is co-chair of Scientific Assessment Panel of the Montreal Protocol. And David will give us a presentation on impact of SAI on ozone layer, the work that Scientific Assessment Panel has done. I will then present on our research on Vienna Convention and governance of solar stratospheric aerosol injection specifically. And then we have a panel discussion where we have 4 excellent panelists who will comment on the report and discuss the broader agenda of governance of SRM. We have Lambert. I have profited a lot by interacting with Lambert on issues. He is a repository of information on Vienna Convention and Montreal Protocol. I'm really happy that you're here. We have Shikha, who actually did a report about a year back on the governance of SRM. We have Tapio, Senior Advisor with Center for Sustainable Consumption and Production, Finnish Environment Institute, and we have Nico Esguerra, Director of International Strategy at Silver Lining. 4 excellent panelists to comment and discuss this agenda. And then we will have time for question and answer. Hopefully, we will have rich discussion. So, may I now request David for his presentation? Thank you.
Thank you, Chandra. Appreciate the opportunity to be here representing the Scientific Assessment Panel. I think we in the Scientific Assessment Panel, our future co-chair, Ken Jux, is here, feel an obligation to communicate the kind of results, studies, assessment material that we collect, that we provide the parties. So this is a great example of it where we're invited, thank you, to talk about an aspect of our scientific activities. So in just 15 minutes or less, I want to go through a few key slides and make a few key points. I will also be giving a side event on Thursday at 1 o'clock here, where we'll go into it in a little deeper scientific way. So next slide. Oh, back up, please. So I'm a co-chair of the Scientific Assessment Panel, and I'm also a director of a laboratory in NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in Boulder, Colorado. Next slide. So just as kind of a boundary condition reminder, the motivation objective of our panel activities is to provide, enhance, strengthen the scientific foundation for Montreal Protocol policy deliberations and decisions. And so we adhere rather strictly to that, which means we're policy relevant, but we're policy neutral. Hence, the SAP doesn't advocate for actions or policies like the implementation or governance of climate intervention. We're focused on providing that foundation. This presentation, like all or most side event presentations, I'll make sure it gets put on the portal so you'll have that. And again, a comment about the side event. Next slide. So what is climate intervention? This topic is very confusing in the world. Whether you talk to a number of scientists or policymakers or the public, they don't have a shared vision and kind of even a vocabulary about this topic. So this is one of the aims of our chapter that we did in 2022, is it helps just set a baseline, establish terms of how to talk about this particular topic. So climate intervention, also known as geoengineering or solar radiation modification, SRM, refers to cooling the Earth by human means to offset the warming and other impacts due to greenhouse gas accumulation. And this quote from our U.S. National Academy, I think, is one of the more important things you can say today about climate intervention. Should it ever become important for society to cool Earth rapidly, albedo modification, meaning reflecting light back to the space, in particular stratospheric aerosol injection and possibly marine cloud brightening, are the only ways that have been suggested by which humans could potentially cool the Earth within years after deployment. Again, one of the most important statements you could say today, because that word only really focuses society, politicians, scientists' attention. If that's really true, then we ought to be paying attention, because it very well may become the case that we would like to cool the Earth within years after deployment. The principal climate intervention methods under that SRM umbrella are stratospheric aerosol injection, which we call SAI, marine cloud brightening, we call MCB, and cirrus cloud thinning, CCT. And here's the schematic on the right that shows how we come about to reflect some of that energy back to space. Next slide, please. And so, following on from that, SAI injects aerosol or aerosol precursors, primarily sulfur is what is talked about these days, into the stratosphere to reflect solar radiation that otherwise would add heat to the Earth's system. It's considered the most effective and most affordable option to cool the Earth, and it's expected to lead to changes in the stratospheric ozone layer, which is why that topic becomes relevant for this body. MCB and CCT we don't talk very much about. They're less well-developed and more speculative than SAI. Next slide. Are there other ways to propose to cool the Earth? Yes. CDR, carbon dioxide removal, is cooling the Earth permanently, or by permanently removing CO2 from the atmosphere. And you see that schematic on the far right. And CDR and emissions reductions are required for cooling the Earth in the long term. So SAI is not in that category, or at least most people do not consider it a long-term solution. On the other hand, no effective and feasible CDR has been demonstrated at the required scale in the world. So one point of view is SAI buys time for the world to develop and achieve suitable CDR implementation if the decision is that we need to cool the Earth. And this is in our assessment. It's also in this iForest report, this figure, which is quite useful. So there's other methods there, including MCB and CCT, but SAI really stands out because of its feasibility. Next slide. What are the mechanisms for SAI impacts on ozone? This is our swim lane if we're in the SAP, because aerosols are the reason we have an Antarctic ozone hole, along with the halogen loading that we put in the atmosphere. So we're quite familiar with this territory. There are other specifics for how SAI works. This is a cartoon that captures the effect of changing things in the lower stratosphere in the aerosol layer. And I won't go into that unless there's some questions that take us there. And so those three features, reactions, heating, and halogen loading, bring that about. Second bullet, we can either increase or decrease ozone with climate intervention. And that's a little bit of a conundrum, a confusing aspect, because ODSs, we're only decreasing ozone, not increasing it. And heating, aerosol heating is the different aspect here, that it can enhance transport from the tropics to high latitude and move ozone around, basically. And so because of this basic complexity, that bottom cartoon shows a really important aspect, that climate intervention with SAI should not be thought about as a switch. It's really a control panel where the controller has options to change a lot of different features, like in that second bullet, where are you doing it in space and time? And so this is part of the confusing aspect in the world. If someone says, well, I don't believe in SAI, I think SAI will do X, you really have to ask them what exactly are they talking about, because otherwise we're not going to be communicating well enough. Next slide. A really important concept here that we brought out in the ozone assessment is this concept of the peak shaving scenario. Because SAI has spatial and temporal coordinates, to really describe it, one must work into space. What is our intention for changing temperature as a function of time? And I won't go into all the details here, but we're on the black line, meaning no mitigation, high-end global warming. We aspire to being on that purple or dashed line, which is some temperature that we decided not to go above. And the orange line is us trying to get from the black line to the purple line. And it takes us some time to get there. SAI can be thought of as filling the gap to somehow reduce the temperature to the desired temperature while we're getting our act together with aggressive mitigation and CO2 removal. So again, talking about SAI and climate intervention in general, this figure ought to come to mind with numbers on it, meaning what exactly are we thinking about? And these intended and unintended consequences depend strongly on which scenario you would choose. Okay, next slide. So is there evidence that it really works? In the case of SAI, Mother Nature has helped out in the form of explosive volcanic eruptions, the most recent being Mount Pinatubo in 1991, in which indeed the Earth cooled for a few years after the eruption by on the order of tenths of a degree centigrade. So this is a real effect. We can observe this, and then it goes away on the right. And the reason it goes away is the stratosphere cleans itself, and that material that came from the volcano that caused temperatures to go down because we're reflecting light to space, they go away. So Mother Nature has given us analogs to look at least the sulfur-containing aerosol option for SAI. Next slide. And then do global models show that the SAI method is a viable method to cool Earth? When you put that perturbation, meaning putting aerosol in the stratosphere, does the atmosphere respond in global models? I won't go through the detail here either, but the contrast of the left to the right shows how business as usual can be converted into a flat landscape of very small temperature changes over essentially the whole globe with the introduction of sulfur in a particular way, as these models have done. So if we ask the scientists who are practicing these, doing these runs, this is a robust feature, meaning we're not talking about small margins or really subtle effects. We're putting aerosol light scatterers in the stratosphere. Okay, next slide. So, are there unintended consequences? Indeed there are. For all solar radiation modification methods, they're not offsetting all of the effects from greenhouse gases. There's this idea of termination shock. What if you change your mind? Are the hemispheres responding together? That doesn't do anything about ocean acidification, which we don't like either, or reduce sea level rise. So there's a whole host, manifold of issues that if we were, as we continue to think about this option more seriously, need to be discussed. For SIA in particular, in our world, stratospheric ozone layer changes are on top, but there's also implications for the troposphere in the form of changes in the hydrologic cycle, tropospheric circulation, acid rain, tropospheric ozone itself, vegetation and crops, and solar impact on solar UV and visible radiation, just to name the lead ones here. So the Montreal Protocol today is not addressing all of the issues associated with SAI. That will have to, at least in today's world, come from activities outside the protocol. But we can do and are doing, I would say, a good job of setting the stage to talk about stratospheric ozone. Okay, next slide. And then this is just some of the detail of our assessment. And so we, so we're upper left there. We have these unintended consequences, one of them being ozone and heating, and that's led to terms of reference for the 2022 assessment in the lower left there. We're discussing the 2026 terms here at this meeting, and that turned into Chapter 6 that I can direct your attention to, and a section in the executive summary, where it's our first outing where, excuse me, we've elevated this topic to the chapter level in our quadrennial assessment. All right, next slide. And then what about ozone? So it's fairly complicated discussion because you have to really talk about the scenario that you can only look at a certain number of scenarios, which we did. And so Antarctica has the largest effects. We see several percent depletion of Antarctic ozone in a basic scenario where you're trying to stay at 1.5 degrees in a business as usual world. The Arctic is much less sensitive to these kind of perturbations, much like it is with ODSs. And mid to high latitudes is a mix where, under some conditions, we actually increase ozone in the northern hemisphere, which is its own issue that the Montreal Protocol has never properly dealt with. What happens if ozone were to increase? What does that mean for the world? Okay, more detail is in our report. You know, these take you down into the deeper part of the science. Next slide. And then our colleagues who are in the room here from the Environmental Effects Panel, the co-chairs, are looking at how surface radiation changes might occur with SAI. And this is one of the graphs out of their recent assessment where they look at those three factors of biological active radiation and what causes them to change in addition to ozone itself. And on the right there, it shows that there's real leverage that if one were to put enough aerosol to really cool the atmosphere in a significant way, like on the previous slide, those three radiative indices would change, in this case go down. What the implications of that are, I don't think we know. I think our co-chairs, panel members are working that out, and their terms of reference may also include increased focus on this topic. So there's more than just the SAP potentially involved in the Montreal Protocol's interest in this topic. Next slide. So in conclusion, solar radiation modification is the only method. SAI has been suggested as the principal SRM method. Global warming has reached 1.2 degrees C. Climate scenarios indicate continued further warming without strong mitigation or SRM, giving us kind of a warning that we're going to be looking at SRM more seriously. The peak shaving scenario is an essential framework to discuss SAI. Simulated ozone changes are highly model and scenario dependent, which we knew, which means there's large uncertainties. That's why we're working on it. I talked about strong AI in the Antarctic and elsewhere. The evaluation of unintended consequences requires focused research. Studying volcanic eruptions, which we did within the last couple of years with the Hunga Tonga eruption, really helps test our ability to understand perturbations in the stratosphere. And finally, a comprehensive international assessment beyond just what's going on in this body would be an important foundation to any SAI policy decisions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, David, and yeah, if you can, Aradhya, if you can put up the presentation, please. Okay, so I come from environmental field, and precautionary principle is something which is embedded in us, and something that since I started working 25 years back has been taught to me every day, and I do see the consequences of ignoring precautionary principle. Now, the presentation that I'm going to give it to you is first of all to provide our opinion on how we should look at SAI. First disclaimer, we are not going to discuss deployment. Everything that we are discussing today is about governance of SAI research. We are not even discussing deployment because we think we are still a little far off from deployment, and the governance of, if ever that position reaches, the governance of deployment will require far more complicated international mechanism than the governance for research. And as a stepping stone, therefore, we are discussing the governance of SAI research. You can start. You know, in last 15 years, and my own personal experience, because I have been following geoengineering quite closely, geoengineering research in India quite closely. And there are few institutions in India who have been doing indoor research, modeling and other things. I distinctly remember somewhere in 2008 and 9, we had a meeting in Delhi on geoengineering, and the conclusion of the meeting was, it's an impractical technology. Let's do something in labs. That was 2008. Next. Then you reach about 2012, 2013, and then scientists have started talking about, specifically SAI as an emergency solution. That listen, we need to be ready for this technology if we are not able to do anything to reduce temperature. So let's think about SAI as an emergency solution. That was about 2012, 2013. And then just a month back, there was a big geoengineering meeting in India where, as David said, we are now talking about SAI as a partial or complete substitute to mitigation of GHG emission. We are now saying, listen, we will not be able to mitigate emission, and that we are on that black line, that whatever you do with aggressive mitigation, you will be on that orange line. And therefore, let's start talking about using SAI alongside other GHG mitigation strategy. Now, all this has happened, as I said, in the last 15 years of my own experience. So the rapidity with which this technology discussion has grown, the governance has not taken, has not been discussed at the same pace. So the technology is moving very fast, research is happening. Next slide. But as I started by saying, I come from an environmental field where precautionary principle is very, very important and an integral part of international law. I look at SRM as a technology whose benefit is right now in the realms of theory. It is unproven. I am not sure that we will ever be able to prove it, because to prove it, you will have to have really large-scale deployment experiment. And as an environmentalist, I believe that the benefits can be achieved by mitigation, resilience, and adaptation, if we are serious. So I look at SRM benefit from that perspective. The magnitude of risk, I have looked very closely to impact on monsoon, especially. I come from monsoon-driven economy. Is very poorly understood, is likely to be high. And the scope of risk is global. It is going to be uneven. So if there is a risk, it might impact some country more, some country less. And importantly, it extends beyond national borders. So it's a trans-boundary issue. It's not a technology which a country can use or a company can use and say that the impact is going to be controlled or remain within the national boundaries. That's not going to happen. So these are critical issues from our perspective that needs to be considered as we are discussing SRM. Next. And therefore the need for governance. Right now, research is concentrated in few countries. You can look at the US, some work happening in Australia, some European universities are doing some work, India is doing some work, there is some work happening in China. So there are a handful of countries who are doing research right now. But there's limited information sharing. We do not know who is doing what because only peer-reviewed articles are published. I know about marine cloud brightening work that is happening in Australia. They haven't published a peer-review report so far. So there's a limited information sharing, and then now there's discussion on outdoor experiments. But what is the boundary between a small scale, large scale experiment and deployment? We are not very clear. Okay, there's no definition in terms of what is a small scale experiment. Similarly, what is climate adaptation and what is SRM deployment? Is marine cloud brightening a climate adaptation or is it SRM? And then there is overlap between climate science experiment and SRM experiment. These are gray areas of governance that we need to discuss. And therefore, research governance is needed because the scope of risk extend beyond national border. I don't know what will be the impact. As a civil society organization, I do not know what is going to be the impact of a small scale outdoor experiment, quote unquote. Okay. But if the risk is beyond national border, it requires an international response. Next. Fortunately, SRM is being taken seriously by other multilateral treaties. Vienna Convention and Montreal Protocol has started looking at it from research perspective, but some of the convention have actually moved beyond that. Convention on Biodiversity, for example, in 2010 COP decision basically banned geoengineering, saying we will not have geoengineering. There will be narrow exception for a smaller scale research, and the language is only if they are justified by the need to gather specific scientific data and are subject to a thorough prior assessment of the potential impacts on the environment. This is a COP decision of CBD in 2010. Unfortunately, they have not followed through this decision. So they have not developed a framework for prior assessment and approval, though the COP decision has come. The problem with CBD is that US is not a party to Convention on Biodiversity. Then you have London Convention on Marine Pollution, 1972 convention, and in 2010 again, they created a research assessment framework for ocean fertilization. Essentially a research framework which will decide on which is a legitimate ocean fertilization experiment and which is not. And as you know, ocean fertilization is a type of carbon dioxide removal geoengineering technology. It has limited parties, 87 parties are there. India is not a party to London Convention on Marine Pollution. Next. Then we have protocol from London Convention, which is London Protocol on Marine Pollution. And in 2013, basically the parties took a decision of creating a negative list, saying all activity, including experiments on ocean-based geoengineering, is prohibited unless expressly assessed and permitted. 2013. And we have Outer Space Treaty, which looks at impact in outer space. But as David said, the most important technology doesn't figure in the governance. A stratospheric aerosol injection, which is the most advanced SRM technology. And that's where we come in with our research report. Next. I'm not going to repeat, but all assessment panels say that there is going to be modification in ozone layer. It could be less or it could be more, it could be, what impact it will have is within the domain of discussion, but what is clear is that stratospheric aerosol injection will modify ozone layer. That's undisputed because the chemistry is very clear. Next. And that's where Vienna Convention comes in. In fact, as we were studying Vienna Convention and with legal experts, we were really amazed with the kind of language. It almost looks like fit for purpose convention. First of all, it is very broad based, and essentially Article 2.1 says that any human activity which will modify or likely to modify ozone layer will come under the purview of the convention, and so will SAI. Very clear. And then article after article is about cooperation between parties, knowledge exchange and research. So for example, Article 2.2a says that parties are required to cooperate by means of systematic observation, research and information exchange in order to better understand and assess the effect of human activities on ozone layer. And then goes on to say the effect of human health and environment from modification of ozone layer. Very, very comprehensive. So is Article 2.2c. Next. So is Article 3. And so is the next one. And all details are there in this report, which essentially lists down major scientific issue which requires cooperation between parties. Okay. And if you look at it, modification, the term modification, for example, in annexure 1 says that parties will cooperate on research related to modification of ozone layer or modification of the vertical distribution of ozone. And modification includes deliberate modification, legally speaking. So the text of Vienna Convention is absolutely clear, next, that any modification, any technology, any modification in ozone layer will fall under the purview of Vienna Convention. And the most important part of Vienna Convention is duty to cooperate, which is a recognized principle of international law, which actually requires state to notify and consult other states, even if, that is what the most important thing is, even if they believe that no harm will result or are taking reasonable steps to avoid harm. So duty to cooperate under international law is about notification and consultation. And Vienna Convention is built on duty to cooperate. And therefore, we believe that if you are doing SRM research activity without making the scope of risk associated with this research clear to other state, it will be contrary to the duty to cooperate under Article 2.2a and Article 3 of Convention. So parties can raise this issue. That's the interpretation of Vienna Convention. That doing SRM, doing intervention in ozone without informing parties would be contrary to duty to cooperate under Article 2.2a and Article 3 of the Convention. Now, can you go back? But this duty to cooperate also creates a strong basis to develop a cooperative research framework. We are not coming from a position that no research should happen. I want to make it very clear. You never know when you're going to use that technology or need it in future. Okay. So research, legitimate research is important to gain knowledge on this technology. But as I'm going to present to you, we need a cooperative research framework to do this. But before I go on cooperative research framework, I just want to get one issue cleared. Next. There is a discussion happening in a number of platforms that, you know what, we don't need different treaties to look at different aspects of solar radiation management. Why not get one global treaty? A new global treaty for solar radiation management. And the argument is that the existing treaties are fragmented, there are gaps and overlaps, and therefore we need new integrated global regulatory framework. In fact, as we speak right now, there is a meeting planned by this organization called C2G, which is a Carnegie Climate Center for Governance, which is pushing for a new integrated global regulatory framework. We believe that actually an integrated treaty is not feasible, simply because SRM technology has emerged from different fields, have different impact profile, and requires distinct expertise. But even if you get all the expertise under one treaty, we do not have that political capital in the world today. In a fragmented geopolitics that we have, with Ukraine war, what is happening in Palestine, India, China, US, just forget about a new treaty. There is no global capital, political capital, to get a new treaty on time. And therefore, we think it is important to strengthen the existing treaty rather than chase a new treaty. Next. And therefore, this concept of regime complex becomes very important. A regime complex essentially is that you have multiple treaties on the same subject operating under different convention. And we think it has advantage over single treaty because they are flexible and adaptable. They allow experimentation. They are specialized treaties. They are more inclusive. And the best example is Montreal Protocol. Think about getting everything on ozone under Montreal Protocol, including nitrous oxide, and where we would have been. So Montreal Protocol is a classic example of a flexible, inclusive, and a specialized treaty. So we think that a regime complex on SRM would be a better outcome for global governance than thinking about and spending time and resource on one integrated global regulatory framework. Next. And therefore, this will be the regime complex where different convention will operate on different aspect. Biodiversity is very broad, basically encompasses everything. I'm not sure that they will be able to move ahead because US is not a party, okay, and it does matter. London Convention and London Protocol will look at marine geoengineering. Outer space will look at if we want to put some reflector to reflect sunlight from space, and then Vienna Convention, which will include all activity that affects ozone layer, SAI and possibly MCB, marine cloud brightening. We do not have any rule right now. And of all the treaties, it is the only treaty with universal ratification. Every country has signed on to Vienna Convention. Now, in this scenario, what should be the regulatory next? What should be the kind of governance we can create under Vienna Convention? And we think that we have three categories of research: indoor, outdoor small scale, and outdoor large scale. We do not think that indoor research requires any regulation, but it does require norms and guidelines and code of conduct for sharing information so that everyone knows what is happening and understands the risk and reward that this technology will have. There is no definition of a small scale and large scale outdoor experiment. In fact, UNEP's independent expert review said that the distinction between a small and large will be intent. But intent is not an objective basis for governance. In fact, intent is generally used in criminal cases, criminal law. I don't think that would be an objective basis for governance. Our proposal is to look at all outdoor research and let it be governed by an internationally agreed norm. That's what we think should be the way to move ahead. Transboundary impact, there are all the reasons that is there, but one of the most important reason is that we should not only do research on deployment feasibility, which will be the interest of a lot of investor and private sector, but we should always also be doing research on adverse impacts. So considering all these, we think that all outdoor research should be governed by an internationally agreed norm. Next. And the research assessment framework that we are proposing is fourfold: information sharing and consultation, a structured environmental impact and risk assessment, independent national oversight within country, and an international approval process at the last stage. Next. Very clear information sharing and consultation is the core of Vienna Convention, is something that we can build. We can also borrow from other regime. What should trigger information sharing? Next. Environmental impact assessment and risk assessment is again part of international law. We can actually borrow from London Convention on research assessment framework for ocean fertilization. Next. And this is what this framework is, which is basically a ocean fertilization proposal is received. It goes through a series of scientific assessment, an environmental assessment is done, then a decision is made whether it's a legitimate research topic or not, and then approval is given to do the research and share the information. So there is an assessment framework which is already there on one of the geoengineering technology, which is ocean fertilization. We can use this for Vienna Convention as well. It's looks like a relatively easy process. We haven't assessed actually how it is being used right now, but the process seemed reasonably simple to adapt. Independent national oversight is important because currently not right questions are being asked on why and how and what of research. There's not much discussion happening on conflict of interest, who is going to gain what. And currently the funding and research institutions which are funding research and those who are in some way regulating it are combined. And we believe that it needs to be separated. institutions funding research and institution, providing an independent oversight should be separated. So this is another thing that we think is important, especially for countries who are going to invest a lot of money in doing these kind of research. Next. And just take the previous three and add one more layer, which is international approval process. You have outdoor experiment proposal, you do environmental impact assessment, you do stakeholder consultation and peer review, get independent national scientific oversight, and then you can come to the international level for everyone to see the proposal and provide an approval process, an approval decision. We think it is possible within the Vienna Convention because all the institutions exist. They need to be rebooted. Conference of Parties is the governing body. I think Secretariat exists, which is Ozone Secretariat. We have scientific body like Ozone Research Manager under Vienna Convention and Assessment Panel under Montreal Protocol, Scientific and Environment Effect Panel. And then we have Trust Fund. Next. And therefore, we have put down some of the, scope of work if we want to reboot Vienna Convention for SAI governance. These are the things that ozone research managers can do, the support that SAP and EAAP can provide, Trust Fund can become the financial mechanism, and Ozone Secretariat can provide the secretarial support for doing this. This is what our proposal looks like. Next. So thank you very much, and we will release the report first. We'll take a picture, okay? Aradhya, we all can get up and just do it. Yeah. You have one more. You can take the report. Yeah. Come. Do like this. This is very Indian.
I lived in Nepal for 3 years.
Okay,
it's quite
sure.
similar.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Done? Yes. Okay, thank you. You all should clap.
Yes. But we should have the flower colors.
Okay, yeah, we'll get the flower. Okay. So with that presentation, I'll now request our panelist, and let me start with Lambert, your intervention, and then I'll go around the table. Yeah, please.
Okay, thanks.
And that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, and let me first compliment you with Dave with his presentation, and you with your very interesting presentation and your research on possibilities to actually come to a sort of a framework, a sort of a controlled, let me say, controlled research via whatever kind of a mechanism. When I look at it, I think you are going the right way. However, where it comes down to not the approval mechanism, but the start of experiments will need financing. Financing will come from somewhere. The financing will be made available on the basis of certain conditions. How can you guarantee that the mechanism from convincing convincing financing institutes to come up with certain money, apart from a trust fund? I'm not sure whether the trust fund is namely going to work totally to convince those financing institutes what you're going to do and how far there will be backcoupling in case of more money and so forth. And where is it going then? I have questions there where I have difficulties to see through.
You want me to answer?
Anybody?
No. Yeah, I don't think that the Vienna Convention will finance any research.
No.
Financing will come from governments and private sector for doing the research.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so they will have certain conditions, or there will be certain arguments, there will be certain issues that are involved in getting the funding for doing research, for doing larger scale research. I'm not talking about indoor research and very small experiments, of course, but I have difficulty to see how to build that up to come to good results that you are sharing in that process that you've indicated with these 5 steps?
Okay.
And I don't have an answer for that.
Let me try and answer it in the end. Okay, let me think.
Okay.
Okay. Shikha?
Thank you, and congratulations on the report, and also for presenting your thoughts from the SAP, as well as a fairly compelling case, I would say, for why the Vienna Convention could be the governance framework. I would like to add, though, my opinion differs slightly from you in that I think it could be the framework or the space for governing research in the absence of any other convention to really take it over. And I say this because we looked a lot at the Montreal Protocol, which is, of course, an offshoot of the Vienna Convention, right? And in that, we were also looking at, again, governing experimental research in this space. And we went to that question from 3 points of view. One was the congruence of the subject. And yes, it is a congruent subject. It can fit into the Vienna Convention as the Montreal Protocol, as being fit for governance within this protocol or treaty. The second was the jurisdiction. It will require some sort of an amendment, specifically, I think it's Article 9 of the Vienna Convention, to include this as a space that governments will agree to look into as part of these conventions or treaties. And the third one was actually institutional capacity. And I think that's the one that begs the question of, should we really be bringing this in to the Montreal Protocol or the Vienna Convention as becoming an issue for already quite strained governments? Talking about energy efficiency and HFC phase down, capacity constraints was something that we heard in the multiples of, like in 3 digits, right, on Sunday. And you're now talking about bringing, or we're all now discussing bringing in this technology, which is fairly experimental, the impacts of which are fairly unknown, as a backstop solution to a problem that it's actually not going to solve. It's only going to buy time. Right? So I truly believe that we can debate, the functionality of the Vienna Convention or the Montreal Protocol or CBD or any others, as effective platforms for governing this research. But I think it begs the bigger question of what is going to stop the politics that has already ensured that this research is not being governed anywhere else. It's the same countries, right? Whether or not they're party to it or not. When UNEA tried to do this, and I think that was 2019, yeah, it was blocked, right? And I think that is what, when we are talking about governance and policy frameworks to really address this as a research, that is what we need to be talking about. Like, what is the politics behind this governance rather than the platform that should be governing it. So that would be my submission for now, and I look forward to hearing from the rest of the panel.
Tapia?
Thanks, Sandra, for inviting me to this topical event, and thanks for David for presentation, and also the chapter you and colleagues made in the quadrennial assessment of 22 on that matter. So, I come from a small country which is almost in the North Pole. And so our view in that way is kind of relevant, anything related to ozone layer. And then kind of next association is the Nordic countries context. And in the Council of Ministers of Nordic countries, we do emphasize the precautionary principle constantly, always. And then if we come to a wider context of European Union, where Finland and other countries are part of Montreal Protocol negotiation team, In the European Union, we have very useful concept of DNSH, do no significant harm. It's meaning that when we are going to tackle one environmental problem, we shouldn't make significant harm to another environmental problem. And if you combine this with the precautionary principle, we come quite close to, kind of framework, ideological framework, how to tackle this issue. And even though this is, whatever I'm talking here, it's not official statement of Finnish government, neither official statement of the European Union, as we don't have them. But we are coming from that point of view, and then another point of view is that we of course want to do mitigation of climate change as quickly as possible, even to avoid these kind of discussions. But on the other hand, we would need to be prepared somehow also to the extreme scenarios, and that's why, in my personal view, research on that topic is kind of useful, and there will be also in this meeting of the parties, there will be CRP on that matter as well, and it may or may not include some things related to the international cooperation on that. In the end of the day, let's see how it goes. But yeah, so many things that you, Chandra, were presenting there are very, very logical in our point of view, that Vienna Convention has already embedded in its rules significant and clear aspects of the governance. But whether it is the Vienna Convention or UNEA, as you stated there earlier, or possibly both, or whatever is the situation, the solution in the end of the day. My personal opinion, we clearly need more governance on that, and what the governance could have inside it, there certainly should be threshold levels of doing this or that, even for experimental research, and which conditions that kind of can be done. And as David was referring, that at the moment there are exceptional situation where the Hunga-Tonga-Hunga-Haapai volcano has bursted immense amounts of both particles and also water vapor in the atmosphere, and then there are pyrocumulonimbus fires there in the stratosphere. So we would like to learn more about that. Would it even be anyway sensible to make any kind of experimental things in there before they have vanished? But this is we go already now deeper into the actual topic, which is really interesting. But it's also worrying if we think about the perspective of citizens. So we had in Helsinki just in August an event organized by Silver Lining and some
brochure artists.
MoMA art, and I was also there giving presentation and as panelist, and so my worry is a little bit of the conclusion of what is happening in the citizen sphere there, and in the firms or company sphere. That the conclusion there was that we can't do anything anymore. It's like too late. The only option is to to have stratospheric aerosol injection. And so my answer there was that actually we have done quite a lot in the context of Montreal Protocol to mitigate climate change already 1 centigrade, and if we calculate also the saving of carbon sinks, it's much more. And then Kigali Amendment, maybe energy efficiency. So there are possibilities there, and hopefully and necessarily there needs to be development also in the Paris Agreement. But the worry is there that if we give an option that SAE will solve the problem, then the mitigation efforts may become less interesting to some parties. So this is one worry, and then kind of a general worry of citizens is that what the hell, are you going to inject huge amounts of sulfur dioxide in the stratosphere? Is it possible? Is it like so? Are we in such a bad situation? And so all of that needs kind of topical research on that matter, and giving information on that research to a wider public, and also we need further discussions on that. I thank the iForest for inviting me.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, please.
Well, thanks, Chandra. Thank you to iForest and Chandra for the invitation to speak on this important issue. As Chandra mentioned, my name is Nico Esguerra. I'm the Director of International Strategy at Silver Lining. Silver Lining is a nonprofit organization dedicated to ensuring that society has sufficient options and information to address near-term climate risk. And we engage with the research community, policymakers, civil society to help advance research and innovation in efforts to ensure a safe climate. I've also found it important to note in conversations like this that our position is that greenhouse gas emissions need to be reduced as fast as possible, but we also need more information on ways to respond to our escalating risks from climate change, and that such information should be used to inform international science-based governance. And with that in mind, I've been very heartened by what I've seen here at the MOP in its discussion of SRM in the past few days. I think from a high level, just to comment on the report, I think it's interesting and it's of high quality. Its analysis identifies many items that drive Silver Lining's own interest in the Vienna Convention and the Montreal Protocol. I think there are a few points where I think we disagree about in our analysis of some of the things related to the research framework, so I'll touch on those as well. But I don't want to detract from our agreement with iForest's 2 main points, that we do not need an overarching international agreement to govern all proposed forms of climate intervention, nor would this necessarily be preferable. And that the ozone regime, especially its Vienna Convention, is likely inevitably relevant to the governance of stratospheric aerosol injection or other climate interventions that could impact the ozone layer. And a couple of the things that make the Vienna Convention so strong a forum or a potential forum for this discussion is that in some ways it provides almost a perfect wish list of the scientific areas in which cooperation, assessment, and information sharing should be taken place on this issue. And also the culture of the Montreal Protocol and the Vienna Convention and its reliance on science and the way that it integrates in an iterative fashion science into its decision making is especially promising. I'd also add too that I think that one thing I would add is that I think the management of aerosols that affect the stratosphere more broadly could and perhaps should also become an area for scientific cooperation under the convention. The 2022 ozone assessment identified a number of aerosol sources that are affecting the ozone layer today or will in the near future. And these include aerosols from wildfires, volcanic eruptions, rocketry, hypersonic aircraft, and space debris. And one thing that has made the Montreal Protocol so successful is the scientific evaluation of emissions of substances that affect the ozone layer, named at the chemical level in the treaty and in its assessment reports. And I think it would be valuable to continue this practice. Now, a couple considerations from the report and Chandra's presentation. I think that the support for research capacity on climate intervention in developing countries is absolutely essential to improving a just response to climate change and improve equity in international discussions of climate intervention. Due to highly constrained resources, developing countries have a limited ability to project and analyze climate impacts and those of climate interventions on their territory and population. And in some ways, they have the most at stake under climate interventions, perhaps you could say, but they are especially vulnerable to climate change. I also think, too, one consideration I'd like to add, and that has been referenced by a few people here, is that there's an urgent need for more information on options that could reduce our growing risk from climate change. And a research assessment framework should ideally facilitate and incentivize that research to improve our knowledge of these options. And a too stringent framework could backfire. And it could slow down research progress by obstructing even appropriate, safe studies and research and create incentives for countries to be less transparent about their research efforts because of the growing and enormous pressures of climate change. Now, a couple places where I do think that the proposed assessment framework falls a little bit into the trap of being too stringent would be the proposed framework acknowledges that it is difficult at the moment to define tiers of outdoor research, such as what should be considered large versus small scale. And it responds to this by suggesting that all outdoor research should be subject to the same stringent requirements. In our view, this would be a serious mistake. It would ignore an important class of small-scale outdoor climate intervention research studies that assessments have described as critical for evaluating climate intervention approaches, and that already has an adequate framework for governance in place. Thus, it would reduce our knowledge of potential benefits and risks. And by these, I mean things like countries where there's already an environmental impact and risk assessment infrastructure, and also a process for managing the scale of outdoor research that falls below significant environmental impact or de minimis impact. For example, the small-scale releases of particles into the environment to study their behavior and the response of the local system helps to develop and refine models of their effects at larger scales. And these small-scale release studies are highly distinct from activities that would produce significant or sustained impacts or effects on the climate or environment. Second, that these requirements for assessments are subject to an international assessment and also an international environmental assessment and an international environmental approval process that are categorical regardless of an outdoor experiment size. I think this also poses some risks like those I mentioned for a framework that is too stringent, where outdoor studies do not have transboundary effects and fall well within the national territory of countries with robust systems for environmental impact and risk assessment. This framework would impose a large burden on researchers by requiring them to perform a second environmental assessment, and an international approval process would be even more onerous and create uncertainty with what I think in many cases would be little or no benefit, even potentially causing harm by substantially slowing research and the generation of important knowledge about potential risks and benefits that are, I think that the MOP is a good example of policymakers that would benefit from that information so they can make science-based decisions. There are existing reporting models that are lightweight yet still increase transparency, and I think that we should look at some of those to accomplish some of the same goals. One such example is the U.S. National Weather Modification Policy Act, which alerts officials and the public to outdoor activities through a simple form and allows them to use that information as the basis for further decision-making, but does not impose onerous requirements or obstruct activities with no significant environmental effects. So there's a portal where, through a simple form, people who are performing weather modification activities submit that information to NOAA. The government and the public is made aware, and then that information can provide the basis for further decision-making. And I think that this capacity to iterate is needed, and it's actually a strength of the Vienna Convention and the Montreal Protocol itself. So especially where this type of cooperation is being discussed, I would encourage delegates and parties and other folks to take a look at other models where we can accomplish the same goals. Thanks, Chandra.
Oh, thank you, yeah. That you want to add? And then we'll open the floor for a few questions.
Yeah, thank you. I think Lambert was saying something really important here in the context of funding of research and any activities related to.
I apologize, I'm sorry.
SAI, no problems. I think it's really important here to find out the interests of different parties and like including Silver Lining and the background organizations, foundations and industries behind it, because you are significantly financing things here. We have interest to know, to have that like transparently explained to all stakeholders in line here. I don't say that I oppose. It may be really useful, and I don't have suspicion of your good intentions and so on. But for transparency's sake, it would be quite important that. To know where the funding of these activities are coming. So thank you.
Okay. I'm not looking for a response from you right now.
Sorry, can I actually just add to that?
Yeah.
So I think one is, of course, the transparency and where that's coming from. But I think if we are really looking at SRM broadly as being a solution, right, to buy us more time, which means we're really talking about, if we remove the politics of this science, right, which is what I think the SAP has tried to do, then we really are looking at this as science for the sake of science, with utility towards climate benefits at some point in some shape or form, right? And I think that's actually where the financing part of it becomes really important, because you then need experimentation to happen in a cooperative and collaborative manner, because you're doing it in the name of public good, right? And so that transparency in financing becomes really important, because you're so apparently not doing this to be able to sell this technology for specific countries to be able to buy more time, but really for the public good. And I think the second part of it is that the reason that experimentation is important is because you want to be able to qualify what the unintended impacts are going to be, which are going to be transboundary in nature, which again makes it very important that countries are involved in an equal vote share almost of it. And I do wonder whether either of our suggestions actually, Chandra, whether it's the Vienna Convention, the Montreal Protocol, are fit to be able to look at it from that point of view, and if really what we need to be discussing is a research platform, that enables this, and that research platform then has this institutional governance mechanism, for instance.
Sure, but I would like to have comments from, and if there are questions to the panelists. If there's any comment, yeah, please.
I'm not quite, as Tom Nixon from the EIA, I'm not quite sure if this is a question yet or an observation, but it'll be interesting to get your thoughts on it either way. Obviously, this has all been talking about it in the context of research, and you would hope with anything that is like this SAI that's getting deployed, there is fundamental research that goes into it before it happens at scale. But there are already companies doing this. There's companies that are releasing, balloons with sulfur dioxide, and then trying to market it as an equivalent to a carbon credit. I was just looking at the website of one, and they're selling cooling credits. They've launched 28 balloons in the last year. And that might be small scale right now, but if people are already monetizing that now, and we're only just starting to talk about how we govern scientific research that looks at it, and this is where I'm not sure if it's a question or an observation.
Yep.
How do we consider that? Should that be blanket banned? Does that come under the same mechanisms here? It'd be interesting to get your thoughts on that.
Sure. Any other comment? Yeah, please. Then I'll come back. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
Ken.
my name's Ken Jux. I am involved both in the Ozone Research Managers meeting group and the SAP. So I've been the co-chair of the ORM for the past 2 cycles and involved with it before that. I would say that structurally, a lot of things would need to change in order to have the Vienna Convention take this over. Basically, how we've separated what goes on the SAP versus the ORM is the SAP just assesses the state of the science. The ORM recommends research over the next near term. However, I would say that the expertise right now really falls more in the SAP for doing an assessment of what's going forward as opposed to the ORM. So there's a bit of a mismatch there. The other structural issue that would need to be overcome if one were to go the Vienna Convention route is that it officially meets every 3 years. So that's a slow process if one were to go that route. So something would need to change along that line in order to make that go forward.
Good. Oh, okay.
Oh, there, okay. Hi, I'm Paul Barnes. I'm from the EEAP, and I guess I'm a scientist. I'm not a policymaker, but it seems to me like, the Vienna Convention and the Montreal Protocol are treaties that, it took years to get buy-in from all the parties into those. It wasn't an immediate, and they've been hugely successful. And I guess my question is, from a policy perspective, if you advocate using the Vienna Convention for, as I might see it, as a purpose for what it wasn't originally developed for, that there might be large pushback from many of the parties, and it could actually have an effect of weakening the convention and the Montreal Protocol, just because this is a very controversial topic that may actually undermine some of the global cooperation for these 2 important things. So I worry that it might actually have a negative effect on, the cooperative efforts globally for the Montreal Protocol and the Vienna Convention.
Sure. Yeah, please.
Sybil Vermont from the Swiss delegation. So what I'm going to say is not, it's just thinking as a scientist as well, and doing also a lot of policy work, mainly now policy work. I'm wondering how we're going to pass the message about the funding of a research while we haven't actually reached some of the goals we've had since Agenda 21, the future we want, the Johannesburg Plan of Implementation, not even to mention Agenda 2030 on energy efficiency already. And how are we going to justify that we need enormous sums of money to, and I used to be a researcher, to do that type of research while we actually haven't managed to capitalize on what we know, what we can do, and we haven't been able to deploy it more generally. And I don't come usually to your meetings, I'm replacing someone, and I'm amazed that there is still so much need to actually get to where we should be going. So we might actually be running, even though this is very interesting, we might be running behind the wrong rabbit somehow. If I want to say that, we have a lot of potential already now, and I'm very impressed how the Montreal Protocol already manages to actually help in that crisis of climate change, maybe more than the Climate Change Convention. Sometimes when I hear it's very concrete, you can see the results, you measure the results. I'd be very, very careful in actually also in communicating that might be the miracle solution, because we know it's a short term with those injections of aerosols. And having actually been representing Switzerland in long range transboundary air pollution, and my Finnish colleague knows exactly what I'm talking about, that has been a huge issue in Europe. We actually managed to get out of that. If we are starting to inject now sulfur in the atmosphere. I'm getting very, very worried for some forests, and I'm actually dealing with forests every day. So we need to say what the governance issue is a big issue, and we need to sort this out. I'm very scared when I hear that the private sector has already embarked in it, and I think we should ban. Actually, we should really we should not engage in that. We need some governance to know what we are doing, where we are doing something. That might come maybe from UNEA more than in a first step, to see what is the frame in which we are working, rather than dive straight maybe into the Vienna Convention or the Montreal Protocol. I mean, I was listening to you, that might not be for the time fit for purpose, could deter the attention from what we are doing now, where we haven't reached actually all the potential, and maybe go a step back and say, okay, what can we do? And as you know, Switzerland is very interested in the matter. We were actually trying to get a resolution in 2019. It failed. And it is true, maybe the countries are a bit more attuned to the problematic. But that was more a comment. But if we want to frame, and for the public, we need to be very careful what we say. Because they could think, oh, well, that's very easy. We just inject something in the atmosphere and everything will be fine. So I go on taking my car, I go on polluting. And that could be also extremely difficult as a message. Thank you.
So, yeah.
I have one question. I'm Samira from Austria, from the delegate. It's more a question of understanding to the first presentation. Maybe you also mentioned it and I didn't get it. It's a theoretical question. So if we assume that let's exclude all negative effects and uncertainties we still have, but let's assume the worlds decide to do this solar radiation management to make it a success. Is it then not needed to keep it doing infinitely, since the stratospheric cleaning process you mentioned, which is ongoing always? Is it not like that we would need to do it like always, endlessly and in huge amounts?
Well, that's why this peak shaving scenario is so important, because that, as it's shown there, it has a beginning, middle, and end. In terms of, I don't know if we can go back to that slide. And so, but there is another scenario where you don't shave the peak, as it's called. You just increase SAI to match whatever runaway temperature you have. So that's a scenario, but in terms of, and it's in our assessment, meaning you'll see that scenario, but we don't regard it very highly because it seems very implausible. And so it's there. And and it's actually it's in that same scenario space, so we can include it, so, yeah.
Okay, thank you. No, I do not like this scenario. It was just a theoretical question. I think it would create huge rebounds effect, so it's not a scenario to really consider.
Well, and it also doesn't reverse ocean acidification.
Yeah.
And so it has its own negative effects. Yeah.
We are now ending at another 2-3 minutes will be 8 o'clock and we will leave. But I just want to answer a few questions which I thought is important to clarify. I do believe that, Nico, using what is happening in the US or Europe as a model for the world would be the greatest mistake we will do. Okay, so a US process and assuming that process can be used in another country would be a mistake. And please understand, SAI is such a cheap technology that you can at least have 30 to 40 countries who can do it. Okay, that's $1 billion. Okay, Elon Musk can do it. Okay, so it's not a very expensive technology. So right now research is happening in few countries. More countries can come up and do it. Therefore, you need an international process rather than thinking about a developed countries with a developed domestic process. Okay, not all countries have it. Okay? So therefore, international process becomes important. As far as I think this UNIA proposal, the Swiss proposal, why it failed was, the precise reason was, it was trying to govern all geoengineering. And that's where the discussion happened, that why UNIA is trying to capture other convention. And that's why 2019 Swiss proposal, and we actually have addressed that in our report, why UNIA, Swiss proposal failed. Funding is very important. There's a lot of discussion that has happened on funding, and that's a cause of concern because most of the money for SEI research will come from private sector. Okay. There is a lot of interest in private sector from Silicon Valley companies to new companies who want to sell cooling credit and carbon credit, and that's a cause of concern. And I for one, would like to see them banned right away. They are intervening in global common, and countries should be banning them. If they are, right, in March this year, these young guys in London, they threw a balloon up, sprayed sulfur and said that we can do it by thousands of balloon and get cool credit. They tried in Mexico, and Mexico got a law to say we will not allow our territory to be used. So this is now going to balloon up if in literal sense, if we are not going to have some kind of governance. This is clear and present danger. This is now, today. It is not going to happen 10 years down the line. So if we want to have a governance system, then it has to be now. And that's where Sikha, the question is, do we spend time and energy in getting a new one? Or do we try to get something in existing one? Frankly, that's the choice we have in front of us. Okay, that's something. And funding is very clear. Whether institution like ours who are talking about it, we must be transparent enough to say from where we get fund. Silver lining, from where you get fund. Companies who are coming and talking about it, from where do they get fund? Because this technology ultimately, is about global public interest, global common precautionary principle. And we all will have to be very, very transparent on this. And let me, end by saying that I believe that Montreal Protocol or Vienna Convention, if we do not start talking about a governance mechanism for SAI at this platform, there is no hook in any other platform which will discuss SAI. There's no hook. And therefore, whether you like it or not like it, ultimately solar radiation management that will affect ozone layer will have to be discussed at ozone platforms. There's no other platform to discuss it. With this, let me thank all of you for participating. It's the beginning of discussion. Okay, I believe that the report that CW did, report that we have done, many more people should do report and engage in this discussion. All the contrarian views are welcome. Okay, and I think we will build on this and take it forward. Thank you. Thank you very much. This is